Hare Krishna. Let us discuss on false ego, the transition from false ego to real ego. Now, a person moves from false ego to true ego. We'll analyze this problem from the perspective of the Vedic scriptures. What exactly is the problem of false ego? We'll try to focus on two texts, Yoga Sutras and Srimad Bhagavatam, to solve this problem. We first indeed try to understand, we'll try to understand the definition and then the consequences it has on our particular activity, and then we'll go for the solutions, and especially which are given in Yoga Shastras. Also we'll see some alternative solutions from the perspective of society, culture and the rules governing our interactions. Now we'll try to see what is the definition of the ego, which according to Sanskrit it is called vikara. Now vikara literally means that which leads to change, the cause of change. In other words, it's the cause of the transformation that occurs in our mind. Now the reason that the consciousness of the soul changes its nature, like Srimad Bhagavatam says that the consciousness has two qualities. So we are changing. So what ego is doing, it is changing. What it is changing? I as a soul has a consciousness, and this consciousness is getting changed because of ego. So what is the qualities of the soul? There are two qualities. One is equanimity and concentration. These are the two qualities of the soul. Equanimity in Sanskrit is called Shantatvam, from the word Shanti meaning peace, and concentration is called Avikarittvatvam, literally means invariability or unchangeability. Now in other words, in pure original state, the consciousness is a calm like clean water before it is undisturbed by mud or dirt. So if you look at our consciousness, we see that it is very easy for it to become unbalanced at present state, we can say, and very easy to become agitated also. Even somebody says slight word or some action or something that questions what we do or our perspective of right and wrong, it can stir up a storm of anger and frustration. Say for example, somebody said some word, they said you are a stupid. Immediately it's like going to stir up our consciousness. It makes us unbalanced. Somebody is questioning our action. Somebody says you give such a stupid lecture. Immediately it creates an unbalance. They say no, you are the most dumbest person or anything. So it immediately makes us anger or frustrated. And now the second quality is concentration or immutability. So it is also not inherent in our consciousness presently. It tends to be scattered, constantly jumping from one object to another. In fact, the root cause of this instability is ego only. So both instability in terms of focusing and in terms of being calm. So both the things are caused because of ego. So that is the main problem which we are facing. Now the reason the consciousness loses its original quality is precisely due to this ego. So when we talk about moving from false ego to true ego, we are referring to the process of restoring our consciousness to its original state. So originally I am very peaceful and calm person, unagitated, undisturbed, very stable. But what is happening? This ego is actually damaging that state. I am losing my peace, I am losing my focus, concentration. Now what we are doing? We are trying to restore our consciousness. So we are trying to restore to false ego to real ego. When we come to real ego, we are very peaceful and calm, and we are very focused on concentration. Now if we just imagine for a moment that our consciousness has returned to its original state, we are completely calm and always focused. Now how will we feel? We feel very happy, and these qualities would give the greatest inner power. So when a person develops these qualities, or rather returns to these inherent qualities, because they are already a part of us, this concentration, focus and being calm is part of us. So we are going to again restore our things. So it brings an immense sense of peace and strength. In fact, the focus or purpose of yoga practice is to restore consciousness to its original state and ensure that this state is not only restored but maintained, so that we can remain in this state constantly. Now the ego is the number one obstacle on the spiritual path, because spiritual path is restoring our consciousness. That's actually what we are supposed to do. But now it's an obstacle. So being spiritual means being very calm and focused. Like any activity we want to do, we want to be calm and focused, but ego don't allow us. And that is actually the problem. Somebody who is spiritual, he is very calm and focused. Now because it leads us to exactly the opposite direction, this ego. The ego is the reason human consciousness becomes distorted. That is the core of problem. In a most general term we can say. Now the specific definition of ego. Now to define ego, we have to follow the teachings of Patanjali Muni in Yoga Sutras. In Yoga Sutras, Patanjali describes 5 causes of human suffering, which are known as kleshas. Kleshas in Sanskrit means suffering. Now the root cause of klesha, which means the suffering or experience of pain, the sources of suffering, Patanjali says there are 5. First is called avidya. Avidya means ignorance. Second is asmita, false ego. So another word for ego is also called asmita. And raga means attachment, dvesha means aversion, and abhinivesh is death. Now according to yoga philosophy, the ego is a primary cause of human suffering. Now let's explore how this happens. But first we need to define the ego more clearly from the beginning. Like there is another concept from the Yoga Sutras to understand. Like Patanjali explains that any source of suffering can manifest in 4 stages. The first stage is when it is dormant. No, it's in a sleeping state. The second stage is when it is suppressed or weakened. The third is when it is temporarily manifest. It may appear or disappear depending on the situation. And finally, the 4th stage is when it manifests in gross, like obvious ways in our minds. In other words, like Patanjali, he is teaching that the removal of suffering is gradual process, one who unfolds in stages over the time, that is unfolding in the stages. Now a person gradually becomes aware of how the source of suffering diminishes in intensity. Since the ego is one of the cause of suffering, according to Patanjali, the ego can also exist in these 4 stages. So consciousness we discuss in 4 stages. Now ego is also in 4 stages. According to the consciousness, the ego is also there. So how the ego manifests very bluntly, and we can see such people who have they are like sometimes we also may manifest sometimes. When the ego manifests strongly, a person suffers immensely. A selfish, egoistic person is unhappy all the time, feeling offended or trying to put others down. No, they have, like we may have encountered such people also. A person with an unstable ego who constantly demands attention and in particularly dissatisfied because of the ego can never be fully satisfied. So that is another problem. They are always thinking about themselves. They are like very narcissistic personality, some of them. They are having so much ego. Now we have met such people with ego, sometimes manifest themselves and sometimes not also. Sometimes even we can see, like children sometimes, or our brothers and sisters, sometimes they don't show any ego, they start thinking about others, and sometimes it suddenly manifests. No, it's in more or a normal state, they think about others, but other times they only are focused on themselves, how they look, how they are perceived. Now these people suffer less than those who are gross manifestation of ego, right? And then the ego is suppressed or weakened. As Patanjali says that this state is typical for practitioners of spirituality. So somebody is practicing spirituality, is engaged in some spiritual practices, helps reduce the power of ego. That means whenever we say the power of ego is reduced, what is the alternative? What happens? A person is very calm and focused. So that is the point. Ego is reduced, a person is calm and focused. Ego is still there, and but they can feel inside it no longer controls him. The ego is still present but has lost its power over the person. A person at the level of this practitioner gradually becomes more in control of ego, though it never fully disappears. So this is the, like we can say, the from the top we say it's the second stage. And finally the fourth stage, or the first stage if we go from the top, is when an ego is practically dormant and a person experiences little or no suffering only. And such people are like saintly people whose ego is completely asleep. They are enlightened people, enlightened individuals, or whatever we can call, or those who have reached the spiritual perfections, like that. Now these are people who have attained siddhi, perfection. Now we will try to discuss again from the very beginning. There are 4 stages of ego's manifestation, and we can keep them, like try to remember these things. Now we will discuss the mechanism through which a person can gradually and intentionally transform their ego and return to the original state. What is the original state? Is the real ego. And now let us look at the definition of ego as presented in Yoga Sutras. At first glance the definition may seem little abstract. It may appear to be having nothing to do with us. No, like if you see this definition, how we will see, it's not such a big problem but it's actually very profound, because it explains the mechanism behind the formation of ego. Please try to understand. If you don't understand also, I will try to explain, but we can just hear. The Patanjali Muni in Yoga Sutras, he will explain this definition, very interesting definition. He says the false ego is the identification of subjective ability to perceive with the objective ability to observe. So it's an subjective ability to perceive with the objective ability to observe. So Patanjali Muni, very interesting. He says that the ego is the identification of the act of perception with the instrument of perception. Like as the subject are the bearers of consciousness, we, the carrier of the consciousness. So by definition the subject has the ability to perceive. So that means my soul has an ability to perceive. That is clear for all of us. The soul has an ability to perceive. So this is the nature of consciousness. Now when the subject, while perceiving something, so I am perceiving something, so I am begins to identify themselves with the instrument of perception. I am using something to perceive, then what I am doing? I am identifying with the instrument of perception only. Say I am using my spectacles to see. Now I am started identifying with my spectacles. I think I am spects only. With the help of my tongue, I am able to taste something, I am experiencing, but I start thinking I am the tongue. This is actually the problem. We are started perceiving with the instrument, that is the mind. This is called the false ego. So now, it looks little harmless, but from the definition, like it looks okay. What is the problem now? Now the very important consequences is what Patanjali is trying to say is, he says that as souls have this ability to interact with consciousness and perception, when we identify ourselves with an act of perception or with the instrument of perception such as mind, like mind is perceiving this world, but the soul is thinking I am the mind. Like I am watching a movie, now I am starting identifying myself with the movie. I think I am the movie. Whatever is happening there with the hero, protagonist or whatever, I start identifying with him, and if he is suffering, I suffer. If he is enjoying, I am enjoying. I have an ability to perceive, but I am started identifying with it. So we no longer just the observer, but the actor, the doer. So I feel I am doing it, even though it is not happening, because I started identifying with the machine only. So according to the philosophy of yoga, the soul is an observer, a witness. There is a simple example that we can, I try to say, like I am driving a car. If it's a good car that responds well to whatever we say, and we start identifying ourselves with it, we press the gears and whatever, we try to start it and enjoy the ride. Now in essence, this pleasure is a mental act. that arises because we have identified ourselves with the car. So I am driving, now the pleasure comes when I start identifying, oh, such a nice car. I have to identify with it. So it is, we can easily imagine ourselves driving a luxury car like Jaguar or whatever, and the moment we start using something, it has certain capabilities that give us pleasure, and we fully immerse ourselves in the process. We forget about ourselves and begin to identify with what is happening. So I am started identifying with car and what is happening. I forgot that I am the soul. So this definition is actually the definition of ego. Now we will try to see the consequences of this process, which are quite significant. Say, to explain the process of ego or identification, we can say that the key to the ego is the ability to identify ourselves with something that is not truly us. I have to, as a soul, I have two instruments. One is gross body, one is subtle body. Gross body is the senses, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, hands, legs, and all these things is a gross body. This is one instrument. I have another instrument is subtle body. I have my mind and my intelligence. So these two are there. Now the soul is started identifying with the body, with the gross body and subtle body, with mind and the senses, and projecting it the consciousness on it and trying to enjoy with this mission only. So we project our consciousness into something else, and by doing so seems to make it part of ourselves. So this is the essence of ego. So the connecting force of the gross body, subtle body and the soul is the ego, which leads to suffering, change and distortion of our consciousness. So three things. Whenever the agitation in consciousness is actually suffering. When we are peaceful, we are happy. When consciousness is agitated, we suffer. So that's how the happiness is. When I am peaceful, very calm, I experience a great amount of pleasure. When there is disturbance, that is actually what is the pain. Now to understand this more clearly, we will try to understand with some example. The first is, the moment when we wake up, what is the first thought that comes to when we wake up? Of course, we generally want to sleep for some more time. But let's think of it from the perspective of how our consciousness comes back online. We are offline, we are online now. So according to yoga, there are 4 stages of consciousness written. When a person wakes up, consciousness is asleep in some state, and when we wake up, the first thing we feel is the feeling of existence. I know I exist. So this is the first thing that happens. Just a basic feeling of being, awareness of existence. Then after this initial awareness, we realize that I exist. That I comes as a second part. First we just existed, then comes that I exist, then I comes into focus. This is very important. The ego is activated at the second stage. So Vedas describe that the process of creation, they say that there was first Mahat, a pure reason, Mahat Tattva it is called. It is arised, followed by Ahankara. So this is a second stage, the Ahankara comes, the sense of I, the sense of separatedness. So when we wake up, a similar process happens. First we have the simple feeling of being, and then we remember our separatedness or our I, and after that what happens? Since I exist, it means what? It means I want. In neutral philosophical language, that says that I know or I understand, but essentially it means I want. Generally say I know, I understand. No, it is actually I want. This I wakes up with all its associated desires, triggering the mechanism of wanting. I want something, I want to experience something, I want to feel something, I want to become someone, and so on. There are all these 4 functions of consciousness. And finally the next stage is, if I want, then what? I should act. So first is I, then first is exist, then I exist, then I want, then I will act. So this is the process it goes. So we are all familiar with this state of being without I, like it's a deep sleep state. So whenever we are, every day we almost take 2 hours of deep sleep state where I don't exist. According to Vedas, Now this experience expands, and that's why actually we are able to get that nourishment, and that when we get such rejuvenation that happens in our consciousness is because of the 2 hours of deep sleep where I don't exist. So this is how the things goes. Now in normal existence the cycle goes, I exist, then I want, and then I want, I act. It's hard to imagine it any other way. The same 4 functions of consciousness manifest in every single act of perception. Now we will try to understand it very carefully. It's actually crucial for understanding how the ego operates. Say when we perceive something, whether we eat, hear or see something, the first thing what happens is an undifferentiated perception. We see something but there is no immediate judgment or meaning. Then quickly our mind correlates with the perception with what we already know. Say I saw a mango. Then what happens, the information goes to the chitta, mahatattva. Then it is started processing, it trying to identify what is the object I saw. And the next thought is what does it have to do with me. Then we see a connection with it. We began to identify ourselves with that perceived, what we perceived. Say I saw my mother. Initially the programming goes to my consciousness. It program the eyes took the message, gave it to my subconscious mind. Mind process and tells she is your mother. Now immediately I start relating with that object. When I perceived, then I had to know what is that object. So that is a second level. And now if you can't identify with it, it ceases to exist. We don't mind. Say now for example, let's say a woman is walking past the shopping. She is going through a shopping mall. Now this process applied to men also, everybody, but without now she is going, but so many objects are there, so many items are there, it does not affect. As soon as she sees a saree shop, what does she do next? She mentally tries it on. Oh, this is a beautiful saree. How would I look in this dress? If she likes what she sees, she identifies with it. In that moment the ego activates. When we start liking something, the ego is activated. So I see a car, immediately the programming goes, the process, and say, oh, it's a Jaguar. Then I start relating with it. Oh, it's very cool to be having a Jaguar car. Then ego is activated and ego begins to correlate with the something external. And then we think, oh, it looks great, it's a good dress, it's a good car, I would be perfect if I have this. So this is the function of ego, identifying with something that was previously separated from us. The car is nothing to do with it, but now I got a desire to have the car. So ego start identifying. Ego says, oh, she is your mother. Then ego will say, yes, my mother. Once you get the programming, ego says mother, then or your enemy or your wife or your children. So then ego starts identifying your house, your car. And after this identification, next step is to determine, do I want this or do I not want it? Like say if we want, if some situation, if we see some food item which we don't want, immediately the process goes, it will inform the ego, this is this is something which you are not supposed to eat. Ego immediately start disidentifying, it says no, avoid it, he is enemy, avoid it. So if she want, the process becomes more complex. If we want something and then there is another force that operates and makes us feel I have to go in the direction to achieve it, or sometimes we reject it. The same mechanism works. Finally she desires something, she acts. This is the fourth stage. So first is, we discuss 4 stages. First is neutral, then second is I, third is I want, and fourth is I act. So these are the 4 stages: chitta, ahankara, manas and buddhi. So these are the 4 stages process that happens in every act of perception. So I saw an ice cream. Initially the ice cream, the program went inside, it told it's an ice cream. Immediately it goes to the subconscious level, unconscious level, and then it comes to subconscious level where it is told, Chitta from Manas tells that okay, it is very good ice cream. Immediately the ego acts, it says I want it. Then the buddhi says okay, let us go and purchase, the action comes. So first is the aspect of just having the information, then having a desire for it. I identify with it, then have a desire for it, and then you act for it, like that. So first perception, then identifying, then desire, then finally action. So and now we will try to understand the process, because it reveals how the ego works. It constantly identifies and correlates things with the I, creating attachment and desires, which ultimately leads to suffering. This is actually what is happening. Now we will try to imperatively try to understand the consequences of this process. What I am doing now is we are trying to understand from the perspective of yoga. That is, if you remember the word asmita, this ability to identify. First there is ignorance, then there is asmita. The identification with the things is the source of suffering. Now how it leads to suffering and how a person can in principle exist without it and still be truly happy. So it is very much possible. Now our I, which we project into objects outside of ourselves onto things in this world, tends to inflate or expand. When I am projecting, it is expanding only. Like say I constantly want to expand. I want to have more houses, more cars, more land, more followers, more and more things. So this I is constantly having this ability to expand. The easiest way to expand the I is to have children, but that's a laborious job. And today many ways of expanding are there. So there are different ways that happen now. We have our followers in the internet. Now asmita is the identification of oneself with some reflections. There is the perceiving subject and there is its reflection in the process of activity. This process of identifying oneself with different reflections, like those in the various like carved mirrors, have no end. It's an endless process. You keep so many mirrors, then they carved mirrors, no? Then they reflect, endlessly the reflection happens. So it's like our ego is like that. A person can constantly expand their I, spread it out, and by the way this has a very deeper internal reason, because the spirit is limitless. That's why the ego is also limitless. The small part of spirit wants to expand. Everything we see this happens in our lives. Whatever spheres we are given, we will definitely expand our I. And there is always this drive for expansion, and a person is never content. They always think I'll earn $1 million and then I'll retire. But no one actually retires. There is a certain endless process of expanding I. But what happens as a result of this infinite expansion? The person needs more and more all the time. But at the same time, the I becomes fragmented, because he is expanding, he is actually breaking himself. And this is the phenomena that psychologists study. They say that one of the main psychological problem a person faces is that they have a fragmented I that has lost its strength. They have spread their I across many things. In the process of this expansion, I began to identify myself with people, objects or situations that seems to make me more. I feel good because I have so much, as though I have become something more. But what happens when I give part of my I to something that isn't truly me? When I identify with a person, a thing or business, what happens? I began to depend on all these things, and this is the very important understanding. Say now I am identifying myself with my children, my wife, my society, my house, my car, my property, my job, my name. So many ways I am expanding myself. Because of my expansion, I lose my own identity. And we don't know who am I essentially, because we start depending on, I need my this also, I am depending on this, I am depending. We forget who am I, and we lose essentially the independence. Because we are dependent, we lose our independence. We start depending on all these external things. My happiness, my consciousness, my life don't really have don't rely on any of them. But what is happening, we identify with temporary things which ultimately do not bring to me. Then when something happens to these things, I feel as though something happened to me only. Like say if I lose, like somebody lost their job, they feel they lost themselves only. If they, some of their family members, they by some misfortune they die, they feel they are also dead only, because they lost their part. Now I am a husband, I am no more a husband now. That means I lost myself. So this actually they feel, it feels like a loss, even like a death also, because a part of me is dead. A person is weakened because of this fragmentation of I. As a result, a person becomes subjected to a humiliating dependence on things, even though they actually do not depend on them. Like, but I have made myself a slave to these things, because I have created a false image of myself, distributing these false concepts endlessly. And then when something happens to these things, if I lose my car, I feel I lost myself. If I lose my house, I lost. Nothing happened to me. The I is identifying with the objects, and that is the reason there is a pain. I feel so much pain. Say for example, if somebody's house is burned, he can still live somewhere else. It's not the end of world, but it still feels shameful for a person. And the psychological reaction to such an event is often completely disproportionate to what actually happened. Sometimes people are so disturbed for such a small thing. They lost their mobile, and for weeks together they are quite upset. And what is the problem? Purchase another one. Sometimes they may have good amount of money to purchase, but still that causes them pain. The house burned down, you may say, but if my identity was just with the house, now that it's gone, I feel diminished. So what happens in that case, like, no, I am completely shattered. The house was part of my identity and now it's gone. When the house, car or loved ones disappear, it feels like significant loss. But in reality, the problem lies in the fact that my identity was attached to something that isn't really me. No, the bottom line is that because of this identification, consciousness loses its strength. This is actually very important to understand. A person becomes subjected to all the things because people's business might fail, they might lose everything, but what happens to them? A person may be bankrupt, but they can earn it back. But instead, people become so emotionally overwhelmed by the loss that they sometimes take drastic measures. They might even take their own lives. They commit suicide because something happened to them. This is one of the problems a person faces. Now we can see why this ability to falsely identify with the things, although it may seem to provide pleasure at first, because of my pleasure is my things only. Now I have so many things. I identify with my house. People identify me with my house also. They say, oh, he's such a rich person, he has a big house, he's a big person, he has a big car. People also identify me with what I have. He's a very nice husband, nice wife, or he's a nice father or mother, whatever. People are also identifying me with my job, my career, all these things. It gives a pleasure at first, is actually a source of suffering actually. Yahi sansparsha bhoga dukha yo nivete. That's what Krishna tells. So all of the things that we have described are fascinating. Like everyone gets involved in all these good things, but there is a flip side to it. The payment should be paid. If I am enjoying something in this world, there is a price to pay, and we must understand whether we are willing to pay this price. No, we will try to now analyze the problems. The first problem is the fragmentation of ego. We discussed. We identify with many things, then there is a fragmentation of ego. The first problem is that due to this identification with something that isn't truly me, I become connected to things that are not part of me, that is not part of my true essence. Now the result is slavery. Person becomes so enslaved with that, I have to depend on that object. And then there is weakness, anxiety, and ultimately losing of one's footing. Essentially, I forget who I am really am, because I am identifying with things. I don't know I am the spirit soul. Now this is the fragmentation of ego, the very beginning of the problem. And the second problem is we are playing different roles. So the second problem is which is related, but it's important to understand, no, what happened. Like there is a famous book by Eric Berin called Games People Play. Now he says, I started playing roles, acting in ways that I think will gain me acceptance or validation. So I have act in such a way that people accept me, they validate me. Now in fact, if we analyze the psychological state of a person deeply, we will see that a person has at least three distinct personalities. Now what is this splitting? It is known as, in medically it is schizophrenia. We don't make medical diagnosis, but the ego does lead to this fragmentation. The first personality is how I see myself, or more accurately how I should see myself, but we are long forgotten. And the second is personality is how I want to appear in front of others, how I project myself, how I see myself, how I project myself. Say now I am coming in front of recording, so immediately I make sure that the way I am wearing, the way I look, it is different than what I am just in a casual time. That means what? I am projecting myself. So this is and the third personality is how others see me. The most fascinating thing is that these three identifications are often completely different. What I am in normal state, what I am in front of others, and what people think about me. Now like when two people talk about a third person, they have different opinion about him. One person may say, oh, he is like this, while the other person, no, he is not like this, I know him, he is different only. So everybody has their own perspective of that person. Why? Because the person is playing different roles with different people. So when he comes in front of me, he is different, when he goes in front of somebody, is different. I am like we are trying to see, no, if you ask a person, are you afraid of this, are you doing this, and people will give so many reasons, so many answers, and then we get a different opinion about the person. Like somebody he interacted, so because that time he is in a good mood, he behaved properly, and sometime he was very upset, and I can still remember some people who misbehaved with me, and I still have that opinion, oh maybe this person is not so good, because that's what the perception, they play different roles. So this is a major problem, a confusion of identity. Now when we expand all of this, it's important to remember the four stages of ego manifestation. In extreme pathological cases, this can be very harmful. In other cases, it's more of a normal issue. Someone might say, it's not so bad. It's clear that not always so bad, but it's also not good also. The point is, when we often forget who we are truly, or in these roles we play because of the ego, not only does this fragmentation make us weak, but it also leaves us completely confused. We forget who we are and become incapable of being ourselves. Like there is a beautiful Jewish saying, this is like, be yourself because no one else can do it. Be yourselves because no one else can do it. But unfortunately, people constantly try to play a role, to be someone else, and this lead to the second problem, created by our ability to identify with things that are not truly ourselves. Now we will try to discuss some more things which are related to ego. They are also very important. Now we will try to introduce certain framework and then move on to the different things. Now we will try to see the role of ego that is played. The ego has three main functions. The first is an integrating function. Say let's imagine we have a body and within it there are many different functions, the liver, the heart and so on. If you don't have a single ego to integrate everything, like liver, like any normal organ may say I will do what I want. So liver says I will do what I want. I don't need to obey anyone. I will act according to my own needs. So in other words, the ego has an integrating function. So what it does, it integrates all the parts of the body. The hand will say I am part of the body. The stomach will say I am part of the body. So all the parts of the body feels I am the part of this. So they are integrated, they are all connected and they function unitedly. It unites everything we have, our body, our functions and everything else. This is a good thing. It has something we need. So if the ego only plays this role, it will be actually perfectly good only. Integrating role. It is just connecting everything into a single cohesive whole. Just like any organization needs a single head, it's generally not ideal to have two heads, although there is an exception, and especially in the houses, there are two heads, wife and husband. So, but having two heads is still difficult. Like imagine trying to coordinate with two heads instead of one. Then the ego has singular eye. It integrates everything, subordinates everything to the goal and brings things together. This is a healthy and normal function of ego. Now the second function of ego is representative. So the ego is not just a unifying force, it also shapes our self image. The soul identifies with the body and over time this identification expands. The body identifies with the land it was born on or where it is born, with the people who are around us and with the activities we are engaged in. With the body, people around, activities we are engaged in. And if everything were limited to integration function of the ego, it would still be healthy. So there would be a certain order with everything revolving around the singular center. But however, there is more. The ego also creates a sense of separatedness. It is like a shell around us that isolates us. We begin to feel I am separate from everything else. So this is the ego's representative function and it's a problematic. Like when this function is strong, a person feels lonely and isolated, separated from the world and others. From the perspective of Ayurveda, the ego is the link to the elements of earth. The earth is the heavy, hard and dense, and similarly the ego also acts like a solid armor that binds us. Now it creates ideas about ourselves and these ideas are projected out. So it's like, but there is a flip side also, the sense of isolation that comes with it. Like the soul at its core want to connect, to communicate, to relate, to express love, to give, but it is trapped within the solid shell of ego. The ego is what element? It's an earth element. It's so solid, you cannot just move. Water is flowing, air is flowing, even fire is also going up, but when it's come to it is fixed. So this ego creates a desire to overcome the feeling of separatedness. Now how do we try to overcome it? Through communication, through reason. But the problem is the association becomes more difficult when we feel isolated. So the ego craves recognition. It wants to be noticed. It wants to be acknowledged. And the problem with ego is that it leads us to constantly seek recognition. When we don't give it, we can feel frustrated. The child who is ignored, even though they behave well, may start acting out to attract attention. So this is the ego's desperate need to be noticed, whether through good or bad behavior. So the ego must just want to be seen. Sometimes we see that elders are doing some activity, suddenly the children come in between and stand. What they want attention, because everybody is busy in their talk, the child is not paid attention, so immediately comes in between all the center and trying to do some stupid thing because he want attention. We all have this tendency to want to be seen, to want to stand out, to be number one. So this is the problem of the representative ego, which constantly wants to project itself and be noticed. So there is a famous law by Eric Borin, the author of transactional analysis, which states that any attention, even negative attention, or better than no positive or negative attention is good, better than no attention at all. So this is how the ego operates. Okay, at least people notice me. They say either I am famous or infamous does not matter. I should be always there in the news. My name should come in the news. My photo should be in the news. That is very important. Either famous or infamous does not matter. So this is how the ego operates. It leads to many unfortunate consequences. So one of these consequences is that because we want to be number one, we become isolated in our own ego shell and seek ways to stand out. The easiest way to become number one in relation to others is to put everyone else down. That is why many people put others down, trying to make themselves seem better. It's a common strategy to feel superior, but there's an extreme version of this too, that is violence. So for example, while we are not discussing those extreme, we are focusing on the cultural aspect where people simply speak badly of others. Ultimately, the ego has a destructive character. All violence and all pain in the world arise from the existence of ego only. Every painful experience we have and every painful experience we cause comes from this unstable, incorrect, and unhealthy ego. We have to understand this. In the Indian Vedic tradition, Shiva is often associated with ego. He is the symbol of ego's destructive power. That's why people pray to Shiva to rid themselves of this ego, selfishness, and all the related problems. Now, pilgrims, they travel to Mount Kailash in Himalayas, believing that by circumambulating the mountain, they can receive a blessings to rid themselves of ego. Many sages, they go there. So if you have seen the image of Shiva, we will notice that he is often depicted with snakes wrapped around his neck. Now these snakes symbolizes the poison we accumulate through the ego. So our inner turmoil and problems caused by ego. Now what's Shiva represents destruction. So he is responsible for the process of destruction both on the personal level, like self-destructiveness, and on the global level, wars, conflicts, and all. So this destruction is because of Lord Shiva only. Ultimately, all the destruction processes, whether internal or external, all the wars and whatever is happening now in the society, so many different places there are wars, and there is so much genocides and all, they're all rooted in this very process of ego's influence. We began to referencing the academic definition of Patanjali, who stated that ego is when a person confuses the subject of perception with the act of perception or the instrument of perception. We also explore some of the consequences of this confusion. Ultimately, it leads to destruction. The outcome is not actually very good. It includes the endless cycle of birth and death. From the perspective of Vedic philosophy, it is the ego and the qualities of our personality that arise from it, that are the root cause of our continual rebirth. Now this cycle keeps us in a state of thirst, dissatisfaction, and constant searching. So the reason for this is the ego only. This is the discussion what we are trying to understand in the next discussion. Now this is actually important point. So the main thing is we will try to understand in our next section what is the solution part. So this is the problem part. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.